Lieutenant Eric Fisher, Wood's binoculars fogged in the December cold. He wiped them with a wool thumb and pressed them back to his face. Below him, the forward slope of Elsenborn Ridge looked like a junkyard someone had set on fire and then buried in snow. Half-tracks from the 12th SS Panzer Division sat canted at wrong angles, their tracks thrown, hulls punctured not by tanks but by steel rain falling from miles behind the ridge. Craters overlapped so thickly that the snow between them had ceased to exist. What remained resembled a moonscape, white, gray, black, cratered, silent. The smell of cordite hung in the frozen air like something alive refusing to leave. 48 hours earlier, this slope had carried an attacking force, Panzer grenadiers in white camouflage, engines grinding through the Ardennes mud that December of 1944, radio traffic dense with urgency. The 6th Panzer Army's northern shoulder, Sepp Dietrich's prized SS divisions, had orders to break through here, cross the Elsenborn Ridge, and pour into the open country beyond. They hit the American line expecting the kind of resistance they'd steamrolled in France 4 years prior. Green troops, thin positions, panic. What they got instead came from the sky. Not bombs, not rockets. Artillery shells, hundreds, then thousands, landing with a speed and coordination that didn't match anything in their operational experience. German veterans from the Eastern Front, men who'd survived Kursk, later told interrogators they had never encountered anything like it. Those testimonies sit in foreign military studies files and post-war debriefs, and they keep saying the same thing in different words. The Americans fired from everywhere at once. Shells arrived from multiple directions simultaneously, detonating in patterns so dense that movement across open ground became functionally impossible. One FMS report uses the phrase annihilating fire concentrations, their phrase pulled from a German officer's own summary, not dramatic license, a clinical description of what American guns did to his unit. The accounts come from men who fought on the deadliest fronts of the 20th century. If this kind of history matters to you, a like and a subscribe keep it visible. Drop a comment if your family served in the Ardennes. So what happened on this ridge? The short answer: American artillery battalions, firing in coordinated massed concentrations, directed by forward observers on high ground, destroyed the offensive capability of elite Waffen-SS formations before those formations could close to rifle range. The longer answer involves a system, a network of observers, fire direction centers, communication wire, and pre-registered targets that turned 16 separate artillery battalions into a single instrument. No other army on Earth could do that in December of 1944. The British came closest. The Soviets used mass, but not coordination at this speed. The Wehrmacht relied on observed fire from organic batteries, battalion by battalion. The American method fused all available tubes into one net, controlled by a single fire direction center that could shift thousands of rounds onto a new target in minutes. The frozen wreckage below Elsenborn Ridge represented the output of that system running at full capacity for 3 days. 16 battalions, over 300 guns, an estimated 10,000 rounds per day, falling on a frontage of roughly 4 miles. The 12th SS Panzer Division and the 12th Volksgrenadier Division attacked this position repeatedly between December 17th and December 19th. They gained almost nothing. Casualties among the attacking German units remain difficult to pin down. Records from SS formations in this period are fragmentary at best, and several unit diaries simply stop mid-entry. What survives in American after-action reports and German prisoner interrogations tells a consistent story. Units reaching the base of the ridge at roughly half strength, then losing another third before withdrawing. To understand why German veterans kept returning to this experience decades later, why the phrase "from everywhere at once" echoes through memoir after memoir, requires going back to a system the U.S. Army built years before a single shell landed on Elsenborn Ridge. We were trying to solve a math problem that nobody thought was a math problem. Carlos Brewer, a retired artillery colonel, said that in a 1982 oral history recorded at Fort Sill, he'd been a captain in the mid-30s, assigned to the Field Artillery School's gunnery department, and the problem he described had plagued every army since the First World War. The issue ran like this. A forward observer spots an enemy position. He radios or phones coordinates back to a battery. That battery's commander plots the target, calculates elevation and deflection, adjusts for wind and temperature, and fires. If the first rounds miss, and they usually do, the observer calls corrections. The battery adjusts. Eventually rounds land where they're needed. The whole cycle eats 4 to 8 minutes for a single battery of 4 to 6 guns. Now multiply the problem. A division in contact might have 4 or 5 artillery battalions within range of a given target. Under the decentralized system every major army used through the 1930s, each battalion ran its own fire independently. Each had its own observer chain, its own plotting methods, its own correction cycle. Getting 2 battalions onto the same target at the same time required phone calls between battalion commanders, shared reference points, and a quantity of luck that experienced artillerists found professionally embarrassing. 3 battalions simultaneously? Theoretically possible, rarely achieved. 5. Fantasy. The Germans solved this by not trying. Wehrmacht artillery doctrine kept fire control at the battery and battalion level. Concentration of fires happened through concentration of guns, physically moving batteries closer together, which took hours and burned fuel. The Soviets took a blunter approach, stacked so many guns wheel to wheel that sheer volume compensated for the absence of coordination. At Stalingrad, and later at Kursk, Soviet artillery preparations involved thousands of tubes firing on pre-planned schedules, devastating against fixed positions, almost useless against a target that moved, because redirecting that mass required rewriting the entire fire plan. The British had tried something closer to what Fort Sill's officers envisioned during the later stages of the North Africa campaign. Royal Artillery developed Mike and Uncle target procedures that could aggregate fire from regiment to division level, and by El Alamein, in 1942, British gunners pulled off impressive concentrations. But the British system still routed requests through each unit's command post in sequence, a daisy chain that added delay at every link. A Mike target calling on an entire division's guns could take 10 minutes to land, sometimes longer. The Fort Sill solution cut that delay to something the British regarded, when they first saw it demonstrated in Tunisia, as borderline impossible. What Brewer and his colleagues built between roughly 1932 and 1941 centered on one innovation that sounds mundane until you grasp its consequences: a centralized fire direction center, the FDC. Instead of each battery computing its own fire, a single FDC at battalion level received the observer's call, plotted the target on a standardized firing chart, computed data for every gun in the battalion, and transmitted that data simultaneously. One brain, many arms. The FDC used a graphical method, a large gridded chart pinned to a board, where a trained plotter could convert a 6-digit coordinate into firing solutions for 12 guns in under 90 seconds. The math itself involved nothing exotic: trigonometry, weather corrections, propellant temperature adjustments. What made it revolutionary sat in the organizational design. Strip the arithmetic away from the battery commander, hand it to a dedicated team whose only job is computation, and suddenly every gun in range can receive target data through a single pipeline. The detail that mattered at Elsenborn Ridge was that the FDC concept scaled. A division artillery headquarters could function as a higher-level FDC, taking calls from any observer in the division's sector and routing fire missions to any battalion, or all battalions, within range. Corps artillery added another tier. The result, by late 1944, allowed a single forward observer shivering in a foxhole to pick up a field telephone, request a serenade, the code for massed fires, and drop shells from 16 battalions onto one grid square within 5 minutes. No other army's organizational architecture permitted that. The Germans had no equivalent structure, and the Soviets had no equivalent speed. The British came closest in design, but couldn't match the tempo. By the spring of 1918, the American Expeditionary Forces had a problem nobody wanted to talk about in official cables. The United States Army did not know how to shoot artillery. Not well. not independently. When the 1st American divisions entered the line in France, they carried French 75mm guns, fired French ammunition, and relied on French instructors standing behind American battery commanders whispering corrections. The AEF's own after-action reports from the Meuse-Argonne describe batteries firing blind, rounds falling short into friendly positions, observers unable to communicate adjustments because they hadn't trained on the telephone procedures. In one documented incident near Montfaucon, an American battalion fired over 400 rounds at a road junction and hit a field 300 yards east of it. The French liaison officer attached to that unit wrote a report that has survived in the archives. He called the performance enthusiastic but uncontrolled, a diplomatic way of saying these men had no idea what they were doing. The officers who rotated back through Fort Sill after the armistice carried the humiliation like shrapnel. The Field Artillery School in the 1920s operated on a shoestring. Congress slashed military budgets to pre-war levels, and the artillery branch competed for scraps with cavalry officers who still believed the horse had a future on the modern battlefield. Facilities reflected the poverty. The gunnery department's first dedicated workspace for fire control experimentation occupied a converted mule barn on the post's south end. Hay still stuck to the rafters. Officers spread firing charts across tables built from ammunition crates and ran calculation drills while flies circled in the Oklahoma heat. The barn's exact location on post has been disputed by two separate Fort Sill historians, and neither cites a primary source more specific than south of the stables. An irrelevant detail, except that it captures something about the institutional conditions. A major army rebuilding its most lethal branch in a space that smelled like livestock. The Japanese army encountered a parallel humiliation after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 through 1905, when its artillery had performed adequately but revealed deep deficiencies in counter-battery technique. Japanese reform efforts in the following decades, however, went sideways. They invested in better guns rather than better fire control systems, a hardware answer to a software problem. Fort Sill's officers went the other direction entirely. They kept the same guns and rebuilt the math. The key figure in the early phase, and I think he doesn't get enough credit in popular accounts, was Colonel H.L.C. Jones, who ran the gunnery department from 1930 to 1934. Jones pushed his instructors to treat fire direction as a centralized function rather than a distributed skill. Under the old model, every battery commander functioned as his own mathematician, his own meteorologist, his own forward observer and tactician. Jones argued that this guaranteed mediocrity across the board. "You cannot expect a man under fire to do calculus," he wrote in a 1931 memo to the commandant. That memo survives in the Fort Sill archives. The phrasing overstates the mathematical complexity. The computations involved trigonometry, not calculus, but his point held. Stress degrades cognitive function. Strip the computation out of the fighting position. Hand it to specialists working from a protected location, with clean charts and steady hands, and accuracy jumps. Jones retired before his system reached the field. The officers who inherited his work, Brewer among them, spent the late 30s refining the graphical firing chart, standardizing the plotting procedures, and running competitive drills between battalions to prove the concept scaled beyond a single battery. By 1940, Fort Sill graduates entering the expanding army carried the FDC doctrine in their heads like scripture. They'd learned it in classrooms that no longer smelled like mules, though the institutional memory of 1918, of French officers politely explaining how to aim American guns, still drove the urgency. The gap between Jones's memo and Elsenborn Ridge spans 13 years, a world war's worth of procurement, and roughly 400,000 trained artillerymen. Closing that gap required something the mule barn couldn't provide: an industrial base capable of producing enough guns, enough shells, enough plotting equipment, and enough trained crews to make the FDC concept lethal at continental scale. Every gun fired at a different time. That fact alone broke the logic of conventional artillery defense. A 105mm howitzer, positioned 2 miles from the target, sends its shell on a flight, lasting roughly 15 seconds. A 155mm gun sitting 6 miles back needs closer to 40. a long tom at 11 miles, nearly a full minute. Under standard procedure, all batteries fire on command, and their shells arrive in a ragged sequence spread across 30 to 45 seconds. Enough time for troops in the open to hear the first detonation and dive for cover before the rest lands. Enough time, in other words, to survive. The American answer inverted the sequence. Instead of firing together and arriving apart, each battery calculated backward from a designated moment of impact, the time on target, or TOT, and staggered its volleys so that every shell, from every gun, at every range, crossed the target at the same instant. The closest battery fires last, the farthest fires first. The math coordinates the gaps. When it works, and by 1944, American FDC crews made it work routinely, the enemy receives no warning shot, no first impact to react to. 1 second, the air is quiet. The next second, the ground erupts across an area the size of 4 football fields, and everyone standing in it is dead or concussed before the sound of the guns reaches them. The computation required each battery to know 3 things with precision: its own position on the grid, the target's position, and the flight time of its specific round at the calculated charge and elevation. The FDC held all 3. A trained crew plotted the target, pulled flight time from firing tables, thick weathered booklets that accounted for shell weight, propellant temperature, air density, wind, and subtracted that number from the designated TOT. The remainder told the battery exactly when to pull its lanyards. Battery A, flight time 19 seconds, fires at TOT minus 19. Battery B, flight time 34 seconds, fires at TOT minus 34. Battery C, 47 seconds out, fires first. Synchronized watches and a countdown over the fire net held it together. The margin of error American crews achieved in practice hovered around 2 seconds, tight enough that a 12-battery TOT concentration landed its full weight in a window shorter than a man's exhale. No creeping barrage, no incremental adjustment, a single catastrophic pulse. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr division in Normandy before the Ardennes, encountered American TOT fires during Operation Cobra in July of 1944. His post-war FMS report, written for the U.S. Army Historical Division, which makes it an enemy admission produced under American supervision, but in Bayerlein's own words, described the effect of massed American artillery as an act of nature, like a hurricane or an earthquake, adding that his troops could not distinguish between the beginning and the end of a concentration because it arrived all at once. Bayerlein commanded one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations. His officers had served on every front Germany fought. The comparison he reached for wasn't military, it belonged to geology. The British could mass fires effectively by 1944, and their Victor target procedure, calling on every gun in a corps, delivered enormous tonnage. But the sequential routing through command posts meant British concentrations built up over 30 to 60 seconds, giving alert troops a narrow window to react. American TOT eliminated that window entirely. The difference between a 30-second buildup and a simultaneous arrival sounds academic until you're the Panzer Grenadier hearing the first shell. In the British model, you hear it and move. In the American model, you don't hear anything. The shell that kills you arrives alongside the sound of its own firing. Sources conflict on whether Bayerlein used the word nitrocatastrophe or whether the English translation introduced the phrasing, but the sense is consistent across 3 separate debriefs conducted between 1945 and 1947. The man who led Panzer Lehr through Normandy and the Bulge described American artillery the way civilians describe earthquakes: sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to prepare for or outrun. Oberst Hans-Georg Hildebrandt pushed his half-track column through Kasserine Pass on the morning of February 19, 1943, and ran straight into fire that didn't match anything his intelligence officers had briefed. The Americans were supposed to be green. They were. The Americans were supposed to break under pressure. They did. But the volume of shells landing on his lead elements in the first 90 seconds of contact suggested a force twice the size of what aerial reconnaissance had reported. Hildebrandt's battalion took 11 casualties before his vehicles cleared the mouth of the pass. From artillery alone, no tanks or aircraft involved, arriving fast enough that his drivers couldn't sequence the detonations into individual batteries. The FDC system had crossed the Atlantic. It arrived in North Africa with the men of 2nd Corps, most of whom had never fired a shot in anger. The 105mm crews of the 1st Infantry Division and the 1st Armored Division had trained at Sill or under Sill-taught officers, and they carried the doctrine in muscle memory. Observer calls grid, FDC plots target, data flows to guns, rounds fly. The machinery functioned. What collapsed around it had nothing to do with gunnery. 2nd Corps in February 1943 suffered from fractured command, poor intelligence, weak logistics, and an operational plan that scattered American units across 50 miles of Tunisian desert, with gaps a Panzer division could, and did, drive through at speed. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded 2nd Corps from a bunker carved into rock 70 miles behind the front. His orders arrived late and contradicted each other. Some referenced phase lines his subordinate commanders couldn't find on their maps. The tactical disaster at Kasserine belongs to Fredendall and the institutional inexperience of an army fighting its first major engagement against the Wehrmacht. I think trying to rehabilitate his reputation, as a few revisionist accounts have attempted, misreads the evidence badly. But inside that disaster, something worked. The 33rd Field Artillery Battalion, supporting Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division near Sidi Bou Zid on February 14th, executed FDC coordinated fire missions under conditions that would have paralyzed a less drilled crew. Their battalion FDC processed 17 separate fire missions in 4 hours, while the command post displaced twice under direct tank threat. The plotting team broke down their charts, loaded them onto a truck, set up 600 yards to the rear, and resumed computing within 8 minutes. Rounds kept falling. The Germans kept advancing. They had armor superiority, air superiority, the initiative, and numbers, but the artillery never stopped. German after-action reports from Kasserine confirmed the pattern. A 10th Panzer Division assessment, written in March 1943, now held in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, noted that American artillery responded with unexpected rapidity and in considerable volume, even during phases when American infantry positions had already been overrun. The report's author, the division's operations officer, recommended that future attacks against American units prioritize counter-battery fire earlier in the engagement sequence than standard doctrine prescribed. He used the phrase surprisingly well coordinated to describe fire from batteries his scouts had plotted at dispersed positions across 3 kilometers of front. The coordination baffled him. German artillery doctrine assumed dispersed batteries meant decentralized fire, because in the Wehrmacht it did. The idea that scattered guns could deliver unified concentrations through a centralized computing node didn't fit his doctrinal framework, so he attributed the effect to luck or to American batteries being closer together than his scouts believed. He drew the wrong conclusion from accurate observation. Kasserine cost 2 corps over 6,000 casualties, 300 tanks, and enough institutional pride that Eisenhower relieved Fredendall within weeks and handed the corps to Patton. The defeat dominated American headlines and German confidence alike. What it didn't do, and this matters for Elsenborn Ridge 22 months later, was discredit the FDC. The system performed inside a command failure. The artillery spoke clearly through a headquarters that couldn't. Officers who survived Kasserine carried 2 lessons forward. The fire direction method works, and everything surrounding it needs to get better fast. The records don't say whether Hildebrandt ever learned what hit his column that February morning. His name disappears from the divisional files after Tunisia. The radionet at Anzio carried 14 fire missions in 11 minutes on the night of February 16, 1944. 14 separate targets, 14 separate grid coordinates, each one plotted, computed, and transmitted to guns that fired before the observer's handset cooled. The beachhead measured 7 miles deep and 16 wide, a compressed killing ground where every American battery could reach every German assembly area, and the FDC crews knew it. They'd pinned pre-plotted concentrations to every road junction, every tree line, every draw and reverse slope the Germans might use to stage a counterattack. When the 14th Army came down from the Alban Hills, American artillery didn't search for targets. The targets walked into fires that already had names and numbers. Kesselring's troops at Anzio described the experience in terms that echo Bayerlein's later testimony, but carry a rawer edge. These men wrote letters home, and censorship intercepts preserved some of them. A Feldwebel in the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, intercepted correspondence dated March 1944, told his wife the American shells come from nowhere and from everywhere, and that the sound arrived wrong. Not the rising whistle his training had taught him to listen for, but a single crack that meant the round had already landed before he heard it. The whistle he expected belonged to shells in descent. A TOT concentration denied him even that fraction of warning. The crack he heard came from fragments breaking the sound barrier as they scattered outward from the blast point. By the time his eardrums registered the noise, the steel had already passed through whatever it was going to pass through. That sensory inversion, hearing the explosion after the damage, runs through German accounts from Italy and Normandy like a recurring nightmare. Wehrmacht training emphasized the whistle as a survival cue. Hear it, drop, cover your head, count to 3. American TOT rendered the training useless. The cue arrived after the event. Soldiers who survived a concentration and tried to explain it to replacements found themselves describing something that sounded irrational, an artillery strike with no beginning. The system that produced this effect matured fast between Tunisia and Overlord. At Kasserine, battalion-level FDC coordination worked under pressure, but division-level massing remained clumsy. Too many relay stations, too much voice traffic clogging the nets. By Anzio, V-Corps artillery had streamlined the call chain so that a single forward observer could request fires from every battery in the Corps through 2 radio relays and a switching procedure that took under 90 seconds. The plotting teams at each echelon didn't wait for orders to compute. They monitored the net, heard the target data as it passed upward, and began working their charts before the formal request reached them. Anticipatory computation. The term doesn't appear in the 1943 field manuals, but the practice spread through the artillery community by word of mouth and after-action reports shared between divisions rotating through the Italian campaign. Normandy compressed the learning curve further. In the hedgerow country south of Omaha Beach, visibility dropped to nothing, 50 yards in some sectors, less when the Norman rain turned the sunken lanes into green tunnels. Infantry couldn't see the enemy, tanks bogged in the soft ground between hedge walls, and air support struggled to identify friendly positions through the canopy. Artillery became the only arm that could reach over the hedgerows and kill what the riflemen couldn't see. Forward observers crawled to the top of hedgerow embankments, called grids, and brought steel down on positions 200 yards ahead of friendly troops, danger-close work that demanded the kind of accuracy only a functioning FDC could deliver. Miss by 100 yards in the desert, and you hit sand. Miss by 100 yards in the bocage, and you kill your own platoon. The error rate stayed low. American artillerymen in Normandy fired an average of 8 rounds per mission to achieve effect on target, a number the 7th Corps artillery staff tracked weekly and reported with visible satisfaction in their operational summaries. The Wehrmacht had no equivalent metric because the Wehrmacht had no equivalent system to measure against. Their batteries still computed at the gun line, still relied on individual battery commanders to do the arithmetic under fire. The same model H.L.C. Jones had rejected in a mule barn 14 years earlier. We called it the Death Factory, a sergeant from the 12th SS Panzer Division told American interrogators after his capture near Buchenbach in late December 1944. The interrogation transcript, MIS document, First Army Files, records the phrase without commentary. The interviewing officer didn't ask him to elaborate. He didn't need to. December 16, 1944. Hitler's Ardennes offensive punched through the American line along an 80-mile front, and the northern shoulder of that front hinged on a piece of frozen Belgian high ground called Elsenborn Ridge. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held it. Behind them, Arrayed across snow-covered farm fields and forest clearings sat the guns, the 105mm howitzers of 4 divisional artillery battalions, the 155s of 2 corps battalions, and the long toms of V Corps artillery, reaching back from positions the German scouts never found. 16 battalions in total, 192 tubes, all registered on the approaches the 12th SS would have to cross. They crossed them on the morning of December 17th. The Hitlerjugend Division, teenagers and true believers commanded by veterans of the Eastern Front, advanced through knee-deep snow along the Rockerath-Krinkelt twin villages, pushing toward the ridge in regimental strength. The snow muffled their boots. It did not muffle what came next. At 0742 hours, the first TOT concentration struck a battalion-sized formation, moving through open ground between the tree line and the village edge. 132 rounds from 11 batteries arrived in a 2-second window. The snow amplified the blast effect. Frozen ground doesn't absorb energy the way summer soil does, and the white surface turned every fragment into a visible streak of black against the landscape. Survivors described not an explosion, but a sudden change in the physical state of the world around them. The air turned solid. The ground moved sideways. Men standing upright at 0741 were shredded meat at 0743. The trees behind them, mature Belgian pines, 60 feet tall, snapped at chest height from the concussion overpressure and fell across the bodies in a tangle of green and red that steamed in the frozen air. The 12th SS attacked again at 0900. American observers on the ridge watched them form up through binoculars, called the grid coordinates to Battalion FDC, and the request climbed the net in seconds, battalion to division to corps. Anticipatory computation, the practice born in Italy and refined in Normandy, meant the plotting crews already had their charts oriented to the registered concentrations. They adjusted for the new formation's position, transmitted firing data, and 16 battalions executed a corps-level TOT that dropped over 600 rounds onto an area 300 yards wide and 400 deep. The snow turned black. The 12th SS lost an estimated 2 companies' worth of combat power in under 4 seconds. The V Corps Artillery Action Report uses the word annihilation, which is not a word staff officers reach for casually. They attacked a 3rd time in the afternoon, and a 4th the next morning. Each assault followed the same pattern, infantry and armor pushing through predictable avenues of approach against defenders who held the high ground and owned every firing solution the terrain offered. Each assault met the same wall of steel. Over the 3 days of heaviest fighting along the Elsenborn front, December 17th through 19th, American artillery fired an estimated 10,000 rounds into the approaches below the ridge. The V Corps ammunition expenditure report for those 72 hours lists numbers that read like industrial output rather than battlefield consumption. 4,400 rounds of 105mm, 3,800 rounds of 155, and the balance in long tom and 8-inch fires that cratered the frozen field so deeply that German medics couldn't retrieve their wounded across the broken ground. The 12th SS Panzer Division entered the Ardennes offensive with roughly 20,000 men. By Christmas, the division reported combat-effective infantry strength below 4,000. Not all of those losses came from artillery. Small arms, tanks, mines, cold, and American fighter bombers took their share. But the interrogation transcripts stack up in the First Army intelligence files with a consistency that amounts to testimony. Prisoner after prisoner, from private to Hauptsturmführer, naming American artillery as the primary killer and describing its arrival in language stripped of military vocabulary. Earthquake, the end of the world. Why didn't they just copy it? The question sounds naive until you realize how many German officers asked it themselves. General Major Fritz Bayerlein raised it during his 1946 FMS debriefing, and the American interviewer noted that Bayerlein seemed frustrated not with the question, but with his own army's failure to produce an answer. The Wehrmacht fielded superb guns. The 88mm dual-purpose piece remains the most feared artillery weapon of the war, and German 105 and 155 equivalents matched or exceeded American tubes in range, accuracy, and rate of fire. German gunners trained hard and understood ballistics at a level that earned grudging respect from every Allied artilleryman who faced them. The raw ingredients existed. The recipe never came together, and the reasons run deeper than wartime improvisation or resource shortage, though both played their part. Start with culture. The Wehrmacht artillery system placed computational authority at the battery. Each battery chef owned his firing solution. He received a target from his observer, worked the math with his Rhetian officer at the gun position, and fired. The system rewarded speed and initiative at the lowest level, and it worked beautifully for a single battery, engaging a single target. Massing fires across multiple batteries required the Abteilungskommandeur, the battalion commander, to coordinate by voice, by radio, by runner, sometimes by flag signal when the radios failed, which they did often. Each battery commander still computed independently. If 3 batteries fired at the same target, 3 separate officers solved 3 separate equations, using 3 separate meteorological estimates and 3 separate assessments of propellant temperature. The rounds arrived in the same general area, but not at the same moment. No centralized plotting node existed to synchronize them. Building one would have required stripping authority from the battery chef, a career officer, often a Hauptmann with years of frontline experience, who considered fire computation his professional prerogative. I think the institutional resistance to that change gets underestimated in most accounts. The FDC didn't just require new equipment, it required artillerymen to surrender the thing that made them artillerymen. Then, the equipment gap. American FDC crews worked with standardized graphical firing tables, pre-printed plotting charts calibrated to specific gun ammunition combinations, and the M10 plotting board, a simple device, barely more than a protractor bolted to a drafting arm, but mass-produced to identical tolerances so that any trained operator at any FDC in any division could pick one up and start computing. The Germans had nothing equivalent in mass production. Their Rechenoffiziere used tables and slide rules that varied by manufacturer, by production lot, by unit preference. Standardization across the Wehrmacht's artillery branch never reached the level the American system demanded, partly because German industrial planning prioritized tanks, aircraft, and U-boats over fire control accessories that individual officers could improvise from existing tools. German manufacturing precision, famous worldwide, never applied itself to the one product that could have closed the artillery gap. And then ammunition. Even if the Wehrmacht had built FDC equivalents and trained crews to man them, the system's lethality depended on volume. A core TOT dropping 600 rounds in 4 seconds requires 600 rounds to exist, manufactured, shipped, stored, distributed to 16 separate battery positions across miles of front, each gun stocked with enough projectiles and propellant charges to sustain repeated concentrations through a 3-day defensive battle. American factories produced 41 million rounds of 105mm ammunition in 1944 alone. German production figures for comparable calibers ran roughly 1/5 of that number, and the gap widened every month as Allied bombing degraded the Reich's industrial capacity. A German corps commander who wanted to replicate the Elsenborn concentrations would have burned through his entire sector allocation in a single morning. The shells simply did not exist. Fritz Bayerlein understood all 3 problems: culture, equipment, supply, but his FMS report frames the failure differently. He called American artillery dominance systemic, a word that carried weight coming from a man who'd served under Rommel in Africa and commanded a Panzer division through France. Systemic meant it couldn't be countered by tactical cleverness or individual bravery. Systemic meant the problem lived in the structure of the American war machine itself, and no battlefield adaptation could reach it. The room smelled like wet concrete and American cigarettes. Trent Park, north of London. A Georgian mansion converted into a listening station, where captured German generals lived in deliberate comfort, while hidden microphones recorded every word they said to each other. The guards offered good food, real coffee, walks on the grounds. The generosity had a purpose. Relaxed men talk freely, and free talk fills intelligence files. General Lieutenant Dietrich von Koltitz sat in the drawing room in August 1944, days after his capture, as the military governor of Paris, and told General Major Heinrich Eberbach something the British listeners transcribed verbatim. He called American artillery the thing we have no answer for. He didn't mean tanks. The Panther and Tiger outgunned the Sherman in nearly every engagement. He didn't mean infantry, or even the Jabos, the fighter-bombers that Wehrmacht veterans cursed with open hatred. Artillery. The thing that arrived without warning, struck from beyond visual range, and killed with a precision that made experienced soldiers feel like they'd never been in combat before. Eberbach agreed. His response, also transcribed, added a detail that matters. He said the concentrated fires produced a psychological effect worse than the Russian barrages, because Soviet artillery, while heavier in total volume, announced itself with a long buildup, battery after battery joining the fire in sequence, giving soldiers seconds to register what they faced. American fires simply existed. One moment, silence. The next, the world fragmented. Eberbach had commanded armor on the Eastern Front before his transfer to Normandy. He knew both experiences firsthand, and he ranked the American version as more terrifying, despite the smaller shell count. The Neitzel transcripts record no disagreement from Choltitz. The FMS files reinforce this verdict across dozens of reports written between 1945 and 1948. German officers sitting in American debriefing rooms, reconstructing their campaigns for the victors. Bayerlein's testimony about Panzer Lehr fills several volumes. General der Artillerie Walter Warlimont, who served on the OKW operations staff, wrote that American artillery achieved a flexibility and concentration of fire unknown in the German army, and the phrasing carries the sting of professional humiliation. Warlimont spent the war planning operations for the entire Wehrmacht. He understood what the German system could and couldn't do, and his admission that the Americans had solved a problem Germany never cracked reads less like analysis and more like confession. You might think air power would claim the top spot. It doesn't, not in the German testimony. The Jabos terrified supply columns and rear area units, cratered roads, destroyed rail yards, pinned whole divisions in place during daylight hours. German soldiers hated them. But the fighter bombers operated in daylight, in clear weather, along predictable attack runs. A veteran learned to read the sky, find cover, wait them out. Artillery offered no such negotiation. At night, in fog, through rain, in snowstorms that grounded every aircraft on both sides, the shells kept falling. During meals, during sleep, during the brief pauses when exhausted men let their guard drop. At Elsenborn, American guns fired through 3 days of overcast weather that kept the 9th Air Force on the ground. The killing never paused. One detail from the Neitzel transcripts sticks with me. A captured Oberst, his name is redacted in the published edition, replaced with a file number, described American artillery to a fellow prisoner as an organ that plays the same note from every direction. He meant it literally. The TOT concentrations made it impossible to determine the bearing of the guns. Sound arrived from the blast point, not from the muzzle. Counter-battery fire requires knowing where the enemy guns sit. American FDC procedures dispersed those guns across miles of front and synchronized their fires so precisely that the only sound signature came from the impact zone itself. German counter-battery radar, already scarce by 1944, couldn't solve a geometry problem when the geometry kept changing. The hostile witness delivered his verdict. American artillery fired from everywhere at once because the system, the FDC, the radio net, the plotting boards, the ammunition pipeline, the 13 years of institutional evolution from a mule barn in Oklahoma to the frozen ridgeline at Elsenborn made everywhere at once a mathematical fact rather than a perceptual illusion. The enemy heard it, felt it, survived it if he got lucky, and testified to it in rooms where he had no reason to flatter his captors. That testimony holds. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, 2023. The Mule Barn, where Orlando Ward's team first sketched the FDC concept, still stands, renovated, unrecognizable from the inside, but structurally the same building. Artillery officers walk past it on their way to classrooms, where digital fire direction computers process targeting data in milliseconds rather than minutes. The software runs on hardened laptops now, not plotting boards. GPS replaces survey stakes. Automated meteorological stations feed wind and temperature corrections directly into the firing solution, without a human hand touching a chart. The speed would stagger a 1944 FDC crew. The architecture would not. Every digital fire mission flowing through a NATO battery today, American, British, Polish, Estonian, follows the same logic Ward's team codified. Observer reports target, centralized node compute solution. Multiple guns receive synchronized data, rounds converge. The FDC didn't just survive the digital revolution, it absorbed it. That lineage carried into Iraq and Afghanistan, where American artillery maintained technical dominance so total that the problem flipped. The enemy adapted not by building a better artillery system, but by refusing to present targets. Insurgents in Fallujah didn't mass in battalion formations across open snow. They fought from basement rooms, alleyways, rooftops, environments where a 105mm concentration killed as many civilians as combatants. The system designed to annihilate Panzer divisions found itself constrained by rules of engagement that no FDC plotting board could compute. Precision-guided munitions, Excalibur rounds, GPS corrected to land within 10 meters of a grid coordinate, partially solved the problem, but the deeper issue persisted. American artillery had grown so dominant against conventional armies that the institutional muscle for fighting unconventional ones atrophied. Counter-battery radar sat idle for years in theater because the enemy fired mortars from pickup trucks and displaced before the first tracking solution resolved. Then Ukraine, February 22, 22. Russian artillery, heir to the Soviet massed fire doctrine Eberbach, had compared unfavorably to American methods, opened the invasion with barrages that looked, on paper, overwhelming. Thousands of tubes, millions of stockpiled rounds. The old Soviet playbook, volume over precision, sequential fires building to a crescendo. Ukrainian gunners, many of them trained on NATO FDC procedures, adopted after 2014, answered with something the Russians recognized too late: centralized fire direction and digital plotting. Counter-battery radar feeding target, coordinates directly into battalion FDC nodes that distributed firing data to dispersed howitzers, American M777s, Polish Crabs, French Caesars, all operating on the procedural skeleton that Orlando Ward's team built in a mule barn 90 years earlier. The results, measured in Russian artillery losses during the Kherson counteroffensive, confirmed what Elsenborn Ridge had proved in 1944. Synchronized fires from dispersed guns destroy an enemy who can't locate the source. The Russian counter-battery problem in late 2022 mirrored the German counter-battery problem in late 1944, almost exactly. An organ playing the same note from every direction. But the hubris cuts both ways. American artillery units returning to large-scale combat exercises after 20 years of counterinsurgency discovered degraded skills in massed fires, ammunition logistics, and survivability against near-peer counter-battery systems. The 2018 National Defense Strategy used the phrase atrophied readiness, bureaucratic language for a concrete problem. Crews that hadn't fired a corps-level TOT in a decade needed retraining on procedures their grandfathers had executed under fire. Supremacy rusts when uncontested. Carlos Brewer, the retired colonel from the 1982 oral history, the man who called the FDC a math problem nobody thought was a math problem, added something at the end of that recording that the Fort Sill archivist flagged with a pencil mark in the margin. He talked about the German prisoners he'd seen at Elsenborn, hollow-eyed men trudging through the snow with their hands up, ears bleeding from concussion. He said he felt no satisfaction. They were artillerymen too. They just didn't have the system. 13 years from a mule barn to a frozen ridge, 192 guns, 10,000 rounds in 72 hours, 4,000 survivors from 20,000.